I'm joined by Doug McCorry, the well-known neurologist, who's here to explain a little bit about how stroke affects us medically. So, Doug, what causes the disabilities from stroke?
Well, stroke is a clinical problem that results from a lack or effect of a blood supply to part of the brain. And so that's what a stroke is. And the symptoms arise because the part of the brain that's supplied by the blood stops working. And so the feature of a stroke is it's very sudden in onset. So it can be very varied in what happens, but it depends on which part of the blood supply and which part of the brain is affected. And from there, you get symptoms. But key always is that they come on suddenly. They might stutter, they might jump, but this is a sudden onset that tells us that it's a stroke. And what the stroke does and how it affects you is entirely dependent on where it is in the brain, what the blood supply is. So it can be very variable, and entirely dependent on which part of the blood supply or which part of the brain is affected. It's dependent on what symptoms you would get.
Right. And why is it that, or how is it that repair and recovery can take place and again be so varied?
Well, there's with a stroke, you get a blockage of a blood supply to part of the brain, and that part of the brain then will potentially die. There's a window of opportunity treatment. That's why stroke is an emergency, to get people in the hospital to get that treatment. But if that treatment isn't, if that part of the brain dies, then that part of the brain, the function of that part of the brain will also be affected too. So the most obvious might be, say, language. If it's part of the brain, if you're right-handed, your language is nearly always in the left hemisphere. And if the stroke were to affect the language centers, you would suddenly develop a problem of loss of language or an ability to speak properly. But with time, that part of the brain would then be seen on a scan to die, and the brain cells would die in that area. But then begins the process of healing. And the process of healing takes time because the brain is healing. But also there's within that process is the plasticity of the brain, the ability of the brain to heal, and you as an individual to learn new ways of doing things. And that's where rehabilitation comes in, because say if you're paralyzed and you've got weakness, they've got the healing of the brain to do that, but then you need the therapists, like the physiotherapists, to relearn, to do different connections within the brain, to do the movements you were doing before, but now do them in a different way, because of the plasticity and the relearning of the pathway in the brain, in order to build up that strength again and get the function back into the limb that's been affected, for example.
So we have both organic healing and therapeutic intervention working towards the same end.
Exactly that. And you will need, the therapist will know the hard work that requires for individuals that experience a stroke with the therapy interventions can make a marked difference, from there. And that difference is practice, but it is actually within the brain itself. You're relearning, reconnecting brain cells and pathways to relearn a function that you previously had done as a child and it developed. Now you're having to relearn that as an adult, but it can be done. But it isn't something it is, while there's a natural healing process, you need that therapy input to really to really make progress, and to really to try and get back as much capacity of recovery as possible through the healing and through the therapy that we receive.
Good. And is there a time limit for intervention?
Well, if we think about therapy, all right, first of all, so I mean, we know with strokes, you want prevention and you want treatment when you have the stroke to try and thrombolysis and the emergency treatments. But if we think about recovery from a stroke, then, the most recovery is seen early, within weeks and months. But the recovery phase of a stroke really is over a period of years. All right. So you're going to have the hard work and intervention and the intensive rehabilitation in the early phase after a stroke, weeks and months. But I would say to you that if you're a stroke survivor, your rehabilitation will probably never end, because you're always trying to maintain the recovery and improve on the recovery. And of course, we're all getting older. So, and older people do have more strokes. So we're trying to absolutely always maintain our function. So I'd say that while the rehabilitation is focused on the early weeks and months of recovery, the rehabilitation of a stroke never really ends as such, from there, as I would see it.
Thank you.